My name is Olivia. I was 26 years old when I got married. And on the most important day of my life, the people I had loved unconditionally since the day I was born, my own family chose not to show up. Not because of an emergency. Not because of a car accident on the highway. Not because the weather knocked out a flight or a hospital called with something urgent. They didn't come to my wedding because my sister had a gender reveal party on the same day. And before you say anything, yeah, you heard that right. A gender reveal party. Not a surgery. Not a crisis. A party with pink and blue balloons and a cake with a little surprise inside. That is what they chose over watching me walk down the aisle. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if these kinds of stories speak to something real in you, and leave a comment below. I genuinely read every single one. Okay, let me take you back to where this all started. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio. Nothing fancy. My parents were hard workers. My dad spent 30 years at a manufacturing plant. My mom worked part-time at a dental office and managed the entire household with what felt like military precision. There were two of us kids. Me, Olivia, the older one, and my sister, Cassandra. Everyone called her Cassie, who was 3 years younger than me. Now, I want to be really careful here, because this isn't a story where I paint my sister as a monster. She wasn't. She was just the favorite. And maybe that sounds bitter coming out of my mouth, but I'm not saying it with bitterness anymore. I'm saying it because it's the honest truth, and you need to understand the foundation before the cracks start to show. Cassie was the one who got the bigger birthday parties. She was the one whose high school plays got recorded from the front row, while I sat in the back and watched my parents rushing in late from her practice. She was the one whose college visits got turned into little family road trips. She was the one who, when she called with news, any news, good or small, got my mother on the phone for an hour, giggling and planning and celebrating like every update was a gift from heaven. And me, I was the responsible one, the steady one, the one who got it done quietly and didn't make a fuss. My parents weren't cruel to me. They fed me, clothed me, showed up for the big stuff. But there is a difference between being loved and being seen. And I spent most of my childhood being loved in theory, but invisible in practice. I learned young not to need too much. I learned to celebrate myself privately. I graduated high school with honors. My parents came to the ceremony, which was great, but left right after because Cassie had a dance recital that afternoon. I got into a good college. My dad patted me on the shoulder and said, "That's great, honey." When Cassie got into the same school 2 years later, my mother cried happy tears, and they threw a dinner party for their friends. I'm not listing this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm listing it because I need you to understand the pattern. And I need you to understand that for most of my life, I told myself it was fine. I told myself families are complicated. I told myself I was being sensitive. I swallowed it down so many times that I genuinely started to believe the narrative that this was just how it was, and that I should be grateful for what I had. Then I met Daniel. Daniel came into my life when I was 23, working a mid-level marketing job at a small firm in Columbus. He was a contractor, not the flashiest guy in any room, not someone who was going to sweep you off your feet with grand romantic gestures. He was quiet. Steady. He remembered everything I told him. He looked at me like I was the most interesting person he'd ever been around, and he did it consistently, not just on good days. Daniel was the first person in my adult life who made me feel fully, completely seen, not compared, not measured against someone else, just present with me, for me. We dated for about 2 years before he proposed. It was a Tuesday night. Honestly, we were at home, eating takeout from our favorite Thai place, watching something on TV. He just paused the show, looked at me, and said he'd been carrying the ring in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks because he kept waiting for the perfect moment, and then realized that any moment with me was already perfect. I cried. He cried a little too, but tried to hide it. It was real. It was us. We set the date for about 11 months out. September 14th. A Saturday. We found a venue, this beautiful old converted farmhouse about 40 minutes outside of Columbus that had string lights and a barn and a wildflower meadow that turned gold in the fall. It was exactly what I'd always quietly imagined. Nothing over the top, just warm and honest and pretty in a way that felt like us. I told my family. My mom seemed happy. She hugged me and said she was so excited. My dad shook Daniel's hand. Cassie, who was dating a guy named Marcus at the time, said it was cute and that she'd help with flowers if I needed. For a few weeks, everything felt genuinely warm between me and my family. My mom and I went to look at dresses together. My dad called once just to check in and ask how the planning was going. I let myself think, maybe this is the moment. Maybe this big event is the thing that reminds them I matter too. Maybe getting married is what finally gives me the spotlight in my own family. I held on to that hope. Looking back, I held on to it way too tight. There is a difference between being loved and being seen, and I spent most of my childhood being loved in theory but invisible in practice. About 7 months before the wedding, Cassie announced she was pregnant. And honestly, I was genuinely happy for her. I really was. A baby is beautiful news, and Marcus seemed solid, and I thought it would be a wonderful thing for our family to welcome a new little person. But the shift happened almost immediately. The energy in our family group chat, which had been buzzing about wedding venues and menu options, pivoted overnight. Suddenly, everything was Cassie's pregnancy. Every call with my mom ended with a 15-minute update on how Cassie was feeling, what her cravings were, whether she was showing yet. My dad started calling Cassie every Sunday, which he had never done for either of us before. I told myself it was okay. Pregnancy is exciting. I was still planning a wedding. There was room for both things. 3 months later, and this is where it gets real, Cassie called me directly. Just me. She sounded almost nervous on the phone, which should have been a sign. She said she and Marcus were planning a gender reveal party. She told me the date. The date was September 14th. I sat with the phone in my hand for a solid 5 seconds before I said anything. I said, "Cassie, that's my wedding day." There was a pause. And then she said, "Yeah, I know. But the venue we found only had that Saturday open for the next 2 months. And we really wanted to do it before I start showing too much. And I figured, you're going to be busy with your own thing anyway." My own thing. My wedding was my own thing. I kept my voice calm. I told her I didn't think that was a great idea. I told her it was going to create a conflict for people who wanted to attend both. She said most people could probably do both. The gender reveal was in the afternoon, and the wedding was in the evening, so maybe it would work out. I reminded her that my ceremony started at 4 in the afternoon, not the evening. She said, "Oh, like the timing of my own wedding was new information to her. I got off the phone and told Daniel. He was quiet for a moment, and then said carefully that maybe she hadn't thought it through, and that surely our family would prioritize the wedding once they realized the overlap. I wanted to believe that. I did believe it for a little while. But over the next few weeks, something uncomfortable started happening in our family conversations. My mom mentioned Cassie's gender reveal in the same breath as my wedding, like they were equal events happening in the same season. My aunt texted the family group chat saying she was so excited for both things on the 14th. Nobody said anything about the obvious problem. Nobody acknowledged that these events were head-to-head. I finally called my mom directly. I laid it out plainly. I said, "Mom, I need you to tell me straight. Where are you going to be on September 14th? She got quiet. And then she said something that I have replayed in my head probably 1,000 times since that day. She said, "Olivia, honey, we're going to try to make it to both. The gender reveal is at 1 in the afternoon, and we figure we can get to the venue by 6 or so and still catch the reception. Try to make it to both." She said, "Try to make it to my wedding. Not, we will be there, we wouldn't miss it. Not, of course the wedding is the priority." She said, "Try." I asked her point blank, "What if you have to choose?" She was quiet again. And then she said, "Cassie really needs her family there right now. She's going through a big change." I was getting married. I was 25 years old, marrying the person I had chosen to spend my life with. And my mother was telling me that my pregnant sister's balloon party needed the family more than my wedding ceremony did. I didn't yell. I didn't cry on the phone. I said, "Okay, Mom, I hear you." And then I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, and I just went somewhere quiet inside myself. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. The kind that's more like going numb, because the alternative is falling apart. Daniel found me an hour later, still sitting in the car. He knocked on the window and got in and just held my hand. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't say they'll come around or it'll be okay. He just sat with me. That was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had picked the right person. September 14th arrived. It was a clear, golden Saturday. The kind of fall day that feels like it was made for exactly this kind of thing. The farmhouse looked stunning. Wildflowers in vases on every table, string lights already glowing soft in the late afternoon sun, the smell of good food drifting out of the kitchen. My best friend Jess, who had stood by me through every single step of planning, was there from the moment I arrived. My 2 bridesmaids were there. Daniel's family was there. His mom had driven 6 hours from Tennessee the day before. His groomsmen were there. The officiant was there. The photographer was there. My parents were not there. My sister was not there. My aunt and uncle, my mom's sister and her husband, were not there. 3 other relatives who had confirmed attendance were not there. My dad sent a text at 3:47 p.m., 13 minutes before my ceremony was supposed to start. It said, "Running a little behind, sweetie. So proud of you. You look beautiful." He had not seen me that day. He had no idea what I looked like. It was a copy-paste sentiment sent to make himself feel better about the fact that he was standing in someone's backyard, watching smoke come out of a box. I stood in a little room off the main barn, in my dress, holding my bouquet, and Jess was next to me. She asked me how I was doing. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way only a best friend can, the look that says, "I know you're lying and I love you and I'm not going to push you right now." She took my hand and she walked me out to the start of the aisle. I walked down that aisle alone. That had been the plan. I had always intended to walk myself, which I thought was beautiful and intentional. In that moment, it felt like something else. But I kept my chin up. I kept my eyes on Daniel. And Daniel, when he saw me come around that corner, his whole face just opened up. He put both hands over his mouth for a second. His eyes got glassy. And then he smiled, so wide it looked like it might break his face. And that was the thing that held me together. We got married. We said our vows in front of 63 people who had chosen to be there. We danced. We ate. We laughed. It was a genuinely beautiful wedding. And I mean that not as something I've convinced myself of in hindsight, but as something I felt in real time, despite everything, despite the empty seats and the late arriving family members who showed up around 6:45 smelling like someone's party, full of food, apologizing in that performative way where the apology is really about them. Despite all of it, I felt joy that night. My parents arrived at 6:52 p.m. My ceremony had ended at 4:45. Cocktail hour was over. The first dance had happened. The toasts had been given. The part of a wedding that actually belongs to the couple, the sacred, ceremonial, heart of it part, was finished. My mother hugged me when she arrived and said, "You look absolutely stunning, honey." My dad hugged me and said he was sorry they were late, that the gender reveal had run long. Cassie wasn't there. She had gone home because she was tired. Marcus had driven her. They all sat down at their tables, picked up their forks, and started eating the dinner that the caterers had kept warm. And I stood in the middle of my wedding reception, watching my family eat, and something in me, some last stubborn thread of innocence I'd been carrying since childhood, quietly snapped. Not loudly, not with a scene, just snap, gone. I did not say anything that night. I danced. I thanked my guests. I cut the cake with Daniel. I smiled for photos. And when it was over, I went home with my husband and I lay in the dark and I stared at the ceiling and I made a decision, not out of anger and not out of revenge, at least not yet. I made a decision out of something deeper and quieter than that. I decided that I was done shrinking myself to fit inside the space my family had always assigned to me. I was done being the background character in a story that was supposed to be about me too. I was done performing gratitude for people who had made it perfectly clear where I ranked. The weeks after the wedding were strange. My family acted like nothing had happened. My mom sent me wedding photos she'd taken at the reception with captions like, "So beautiful." My aunt texted about how gorgeous the venue had been. Nobody addressed the absence. Nobody acknowledged that they had missed the ceremony. Nobody said the actual words. "I'm sorry. I made the wrong choice. You deserved better." There were half apologies disguised as explanations. There was a lot of "the timing just didn't work out" language, as if the timing had simply been an act of nature and not a series of deliberate choices made by adults with full knowledge of what they were doing. My dad said once that he hoped I understood. It was just a complicated situation. My mother's version was that she felt terrible, but that Cassie had really needed them there, and that she knew I was strong enough to handle it. Strong enough to handle it. There it was again. The same compliment that has been used to justify neglect since the beginning of time. She's strong. She'll be fine. She doesn't need us the way the other one does. I stopped calling home as much. I stopped volunteering information about my life. I answered when they called. I kept it surface level. "Fine. Yes. Good. Work is going well." Daniel says hi. I was not rude. I was not cold in an obvious way. I was just measured. I had closed a door inside myself that I wasn't sure would ever open back up all the way. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the inside of my life, something quieter and more important than any of the family drama. I was building. In the months leading up to the wedding, I had been working a decent but uninspiring job at a mid-sized marketing agency. It paid the bills. It was safe. But I had an idea I'd been sitting on for almost 2 years, a brand consulting service focused specifically on small women-owned businesses that couldn't afford big agency fees. I had the skills. I had the contacts from years of agency work. I had the portfolio. What I'd always lacked was the nerve to leap. Getting married and being betrayed at the same time did something unexpected to me. It stripped away the last of my tolerance for playing small. When you have already survived the thing you thought would break you, when you walk down an aisle alone and still say "I do" and still smile and still dance and still make it through, something in you recalibrates. The fear doesn't disappear, but the cost of staying stuck starts to feel greater than the risk of moving forward. 3 months after the wedding, I registered the business. I named it Bloom and Company, which sounds simple but meant something real to me, because blooming implies that something already existed beneath the surface, waiting, patient, not yet visible to anyone watching from outside. I built the website myself over 6 weekends. I wrote every piece of copy. I designed the brand identity. I put together packages at 3 different price points. I built a client acquisition strategy based on the Instagram presence I had quietly been growing for a year and a half. I didn't tell my family about it, not because I was hiding it, but because I had learned something important in the previous decade of watching how my family handled my good news. They would either minimize it, redirect to something Cassie was doing, or worse, offer unsolicited advice rooted in skepticism. I wasn't going to give them the chance to pour cold water on the one thing that was finally starting to heat up inside me. My first client was a woman named Priya who ran a handmade candle business out of her garage in Columbus. She had a product that was genuinely good, but a brand that wasn't doing it any favors. I worked with her for 2 months, rebuilt her visual identity, helped her write a brand story that actually connected with her audience, restructured her product lineup, and coached her through launching a simple but effective email strategy. By the end of our engagement, her monthly revenue had nearly doubled. She referred me to 2 friends. Those 2 friends referred me to 4 more. Within 8 months, I had a waiting list. Daniel was steady through all of it. He didn't swoop in and try to manage my business. He just made dinner when I was working late and celebrated the wins like they were his wins too. And on the nights I doubted myself, and there were plenty of those nights, he would just say quietly, "You know what you're doing. Keep going." That's not nothing. That's actually everything. When you have already survived the thing you thought would break you, something in you recalibrates. The fear doesn't disappear, but the cost of staying stuck starts to feel greater than the risk of moving forward. Cassie had her baby in late November, a boy, as it turned out, which I learned from the family group chat rather than a personal call. I sent a gift, something thoughtful and well chosen. I didn't make a thing of it. I wished her well genuinely. I had no bitterness toward the baby, obviously. I just had no bandwidth left for performing closeness that no longer existed. 2 years later, the year turned, then another turned. By the time I was 28, going on 29, Bloom and Company was bringing in more money than my old salary, and I had hired 2 part-time contractors to help me manage the workload. I was being invited to speak at small business events and women's entrepreneurship panels. I had a newsletter that people actually read. I was building something real, something mine, something that existed because I chose to show up for it even when I was scared and exhausted and running on fumes. I want to be honest here and say that the healing wasn't linear. There were nights I lay awake still replaying that text message from my dad. There were Sunday mornings when I thought about calling home and then felt that familiar closed door inside my chest and decided against it. There was grief in this period, not just anger, actual grief, because I had wanted for my whole life the kind of family that showed up. And I had accepted slowly and painfully that that was not the family I had been born into. Therapy helped. I started going about 4 months after the wedding. A woman named Dr. Reyes, who had a small practice near our apartment and a direct, no-nonsense approach to untangling the stories we tell ourselves to survive our own childhoods. I had never been to therapy before. I had always told myself I didn't need it, which, of course, is exactly the kind of thing people who really need it say. Dr. Reyes helped me understand that the wedding wasn't the wound. The wedding was just the day the wound finally bled where people could see it. The actual injury had been accumulating for 26 years. In every moment I had been told, explicitly or implicitly, that my needs were an inconvenience, that my achievements were background noise, that my big moments were negotiable in a way that my sisters were not. She also helped me understand something harder, that forgiveness was not the same thing as reunion, that I could choose to release the bitterness, genuinely release it, not just suppress it, without choosing to restore the relationship to what it had been before. Because what it had been before was not actually good. I had just been willing to pretend it was. So that's where I was when everything shifted again. It was a Thursday evening in October. I was 28 by then, almost 29. Daniel and I were at home, just finishing dinner, when my phone rang. It was my mother. She called every couple of weeks by then. The calls were short and civil. Fine. Yes. Good. Work is going well. Daniel says hi. But this call was different from the moment. She said, hello. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something stripped down and small, like she'd had the usual armor knocked off her. She told me my dad had been hospitalized. He'd had a cardiac event, not a full heart attack, but significant enough that they had rushed him to the ER, and he'd been admitted. He was stable, she said quickly, before I could panic. He was stable, and the doctors thought he would be okay, but it had been terrifying, and they had been there since the morning, and she needed to call me. I drove to the hospital that night. 3 hours, because they had moved back to the town in Ohio where I'd grown up. I didn't think twice about it. Whatever complicated thing existed between me and my family, my dad was in a hospital bed, and he was my dad. I got there around 11 at night. My mom was in the waiting area, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, holding a cup of hospital coffee that had clearly gone cold. When she saw me, she stood up, and the look on her face, I want to describe it as relief, but it was more than that. It was something more like realization. Like she had been sitting alone in that waiting room for hours with nothing but time to think, and something had shifted in her while she sat there. She hugged me for a long time, longer than she usually did, and she said, "Thank you for coming." Not, "Of course you came," or, "I knew you would." She said thank you, like she hadn't been sure I would, like she knew, on some level, that she had given me reason to stay home. My dad was doing okay. Tired, pale, hooked up to monitors, but himself. He looked up when I came into his room, and the expression on his face did something to me that I hadn't fully prepared for. He just looked relieved, and a little ashamed, and old, in a way he hadn't looked the last time I'd seen him. He said, "You came, Livy." He hadn't called me Livy since I was a kid. I sat with him for a while. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about any of it that night. It wasn't the time. We just talked about small things. How the drive had been, whether the fall leaves had been nice, something he'd been watching on TV before this happened. Regular, gentle stuff. But there was something underneath it, a current of unspoken acknowledgement that had not been there in our conversations for 2 years. It was later in the afternoon, when my dad was sleeping and my mom had gone to get food, that Cassie and I ended up in the hallway together. Just the two of us. And she said, "It's good that you came." I looked at her. "He's my dad too," I said. There was a pause. And then she said, "I know. And I've been meaning to say something to you for a while." She stopped, started again. "About the wedding." I waited. "I know what I did was wrong," she said. "I knew it at the time too. I convinced myself it would be okay. That you'd be fine. And I think I convinced myself of that because I knew the other option was admitting that I had just done something really selfish." She said it plainly. No real defensiveness. No list of reasons. Just the acknowledgement I had been waiting 2 years to hear. I let it land before I responded. Not because I was being strategic, but because I genuinely needed a moment to feel it, to feel the difference between hearing something and actually receiving it. I said, "You did. It was wrong. And it hurt more than I've ever said out loud." She nodded. Her eyes were wet. The baby was in Marcus's arms down the hall, babbling, oblivious. "I'm sorry," she said. "I mean it. I'm genuinely sorry, Olivia." I believed her. Not completely, Not perfectly, not with the full trust that had once existed before all of this. But I believed that she meant it in that moment, that the version of Cassie standing in that hospital hallway was telling me something true. I appreciate you saying that. I told her. I really do. It doesn't fix it, but it means something. We hugged, briefly, carefully. It was not a movie reconciliation, but it was real and it was ours, and it was enough for the moment. My mom came back with sandwiches. She set them out on the little waiting room table and handed me one. And for a few minutes we all just sat there eating in the particular kind of quiet that hospital rooms produce, the kind that makes everything feel simultaneously more fragile and more important than it usually does. And then, at some point in the afternoon, my mom said something that I hadn't expected. She was looking at me, not at Cassie, not at Marcus, not at the baby, at me. And she said, "I've been doing some thinking while I've been sitting here." I waited. I've been sitting here thinking about what I would regret if something happened. And I realized I've been sitting here for 8 hours, and the person I most wished was here was you. Not because Cassie isn't wonderful, and not because I don't love her, but because I kept thinking about the last 2 years, about how things have been with us. And I kept thinking, what did we do to get here? I held very still. "I know the answer," she said quietly. "I've known it for a while. I just wasn't ready to say it." "I know you love me, Mom," I said. "I've never doubted that." She exhaled slowly. "But love isn't only what you feel," I said. "It's also what you show up for. And for most of my life, I've come second. And I spent a long time pretending that was fine because I didn't want to be the difficult one. And then my wedding happened, and I realized I can't keep pretending. I can't keep making room for myself to be less important. Not to you, not to anyone." My mother's eyes filled. She didn't try to argue. She didn't defend herself. She just sat with what I said, which was the most meaningful thing she could have done in that moment. "I'm not asking you to feel guilty forever." I told her, "That's not what I want. I want things to be different. I want to actually be seen in this family. Not as the strong one who doesn't need anything. As your daughter. As the person whose wedding you missed." She nodded. A tear slid down her face, and she didn't wipe it away immediately. "You're right," she said. "You deserve better. I'm sorry, Olivia. I am truly sorry. Love isn't only what you feel. It's also what you show up for." And there it was. The words I had been carrying 2 years of quiet grief waiting for. I cried. Controlled. Real tears, the kind that are about release rather than performance. And she reached over and held my hand, and we just sat like that for a little while, 2 women who had been dancing around the truth of their relationship for most of my adult life, finally just sitting still in it. My dad came home from the hospital 4 days later. I stayed through the weekend to help get him settled, make sure the house was stocked, help my mom figure out the follow-up appointment schedule. I did it because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. There was a difference in how that felt, and I noticed the difference clearly. Before I left to drive back to Columbus, my dad called me into the living room. He was sitting in his recliner. "Doctor's orders, take it easy," and he looked at me with that same expression he'd had when I walked into his hospital room, relieved and ashamed in equal measure. He said, "I want you to know I've thought a lot about September 14th. I sat down across from him. "I've thought about it probably more than I've let on," he said, "and I think I knew even then that we were making the wrong call. Your mom was going, and Cassie was asking, and it felt easier to go along with it than to be the one to say no. And I've regretted it. I've regretted it a lot." I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said. "I should have been there," he said. "I should have walked you down that aisle. And I wasn't. And I can't undo that." No, I agreed. You can't. He looked like that landed the way hard truths land when someone is still tender from the hospital, and the scare of it all. But he didn't look away. He kept his eyes on mine. What I can do, he said, is show up different going forward. If you'll let me. I looked at my dad, this man I had watched work 30 years of early mornings to keep our family afloat, this man who had always loved me, and who had also consistently and quietly let me down in the ways that mattered most. I looked at him, and I saw both things. Not just one. I'd like that, I said. I would genuinely like that. He nodded. Okay then. It wasn't a grand reconciliation speech. It wasn't Hollywood. It was two tired people in a living room telling each other the truth with as much honesty as they could manage. And somehow that felt more meaningful than anything more dramatic would have. I drove back to Columbus on a Sunday afternoon, watching the fall fields go by on either side of the highway. The leaves were changing, deep orange and rust and yellow, that particular Ohio fall palette that I'd grown up with and still loved in spite of everything. Daniel had texted to ask how it went. I sent back 3 words, better than expected. He had dinner waiting when I got home. No fanfare, just food on the table and music low in the background. I sat down and exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. Are you okay? He asked. I thought about it, really thought about it, not just auto-answered. I think I'm better than okay, I said. I think I'm actually getting somewhere. He smiled, not a big smile, just the kind he gave when something real was happening. Yeah, he said, you are. In the months that followed, my family and I rebuilt slowly, deliberately, without the artificial closeness that had papered over the cracks before. My mom started calling me to ask about the business, genuinely ask, not as filler. She shared the newsletter I sent to clients. My dad started texting more often, short check-ins, nothing heavy, just presence. When Cassie had a second pregnancy the following spring, she called me before she told anyone else. That small gesture meant more than she probably knew. We weren't the family I had always wished for. We would probably never be that family. And I had made peace with the fact that some things cannot be fully repaired. They can only be rebuilt into something different, something more honest and less pretend. But we were moving towards something real. Something that didn't require me to disappear to fit inside it. And Bloom and Company, my business, my quiet act of self-belief in the aftermath of the worst day of my life, had grown into something I genuinely couldn't have imagined when I registered the name at my kitchen table 2 years earlier. I had a team of 5. I had a recurring client roster of 22 businesses. I had been featured in a regional business magazine. I had keynoted a women's entrepreneurship summit in Columbus to a room of 400 people. I had built something from nothing during the hardest period of my life because I refused to let the emptiness win. At the summit, someone in the audience asked me during the Q&A, what was the moment that made you finally bet on yourself? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about it honestly. I said, someone I loved made a choice that told me very clearly where I ranked in their priorities. And instead of arguing about it or trying to change their mind, I decided to put all that energy into something they couldn't take from me, into building a life so full and so real that their absence couldn't define the shape of it. The room was quiet for a second, and then someone started clapping, and it moved through the audience like a wave, and I stood there at the podium in a suit I had bought with money I had earned, in a room full of people who had shown up for me, and I felt something I had been searching for since childhood, something I had chased in my family's approval for 26 years without finding it. I felt completely and without question that I was enough, that I had always been enough, that I had never actually needed anyone to confirm it. I had just needed to stop waiting for the confirmation and start acting like I already knew. That feeling, quiet, earned, unshakable, that's the thing no one can give you and no one can take away. You can't be handed it. You have to build it, brick by brick. That feeling, quiet, earned, unshakable, that's the thing no one can give you and no one can take away. You can't be handed it. You have to build it, brick by brick, through every morning you get up and try again anyway. Through every day you choose yourself when everything in your history told you to choose smaller. Through every moment you hold your head up and keep walking even when the people who were supposed to be your loudest supporters chose to stand somewhere else. I'm not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. The anger burned off slowly, over 2 years of therapy and honest conversation, and doing the real work of building a life instead of grieving the one I hadn't gotten. What replaced the anger was something quieter and more durable, something that feels like clarity, like knowing fully and finally who I am and what I'm worth, not because someone told me, but because I showed up for myself when it counted most. My family and I had Christmas together this past December. First time in almost 2 years that we'd all been in the same house for a holiday. It was imperfect, a little awkward in the early hours, a little careful with certain topics, the way any rebuilding relationship is when you're still figuring out the new shape of things. But it was also warm, real. My nephew toddled around the living room, wreaking cheerful destruction on the ornaments. Daniel and my dad watched football and actually seemed to enjoy it. My mom and I made the pies together, side by side in her kitchen, and she told me about a small business owner she'd read about in an article and said, "It reminded me of you, the way you started from nothing." It was a small thing to say, but I heard what was inside it. I heard, "I see you. I see what you've built. I see that I underestimated you. And I am trying in my imperfect, late human way to make that right." And I let it in. I didn't deflect it or minimize it or protect myself from it by keeping the door closed. I let it in because that's the other thing healing requires. Not just the ability to set boundaries and hold them, but the willingness to let warmth back in when it's genuinely offered. Not naively, not at the expense of yourself, but with open hands and clear eyes. Cassie pulled me aside before dinner that evening. Her daughter, a second baby, the one she called me about first, was asleep on a blanket in the corner of the living room, tiny and peaceful. Cassie looked at her, and then looked at me and said, "I want her to know her, Aunt Olivia. I mean, really know you." I looked at that baby, at those little fists curled up beside her face, at the new life that had come into our family, innocent and unmarked by any of the history that preceded her. "She will," I said. "I'll make sure of it." And I meant it. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Not as a lesson, because I'm not standing here pretending to have it all figured out, but as something I know in my bones from living through it. When people show you where you rank, believe them. Not to punish them, not to write them off, but believe them clearly and honestly so you can make informed decisions about where to put your energy. You cannot build yourself up if you're constantly funneling your belief into people who use it to fill themselves without returning anything back to you. There is only so much of yourself to give before the well runs dry. And the rebuilding, the slow, unglamorous day-after-day process of becoming someone who doesn't need external validation to feel whole, that is the real work. That's the part nobody puts in the highlight reel. It's not one dramatic confrontation where you finally say the thing you've been holding. It's not the moment the apology finally comes. It's all the Tuesday mornings in between when you choose, again, to invest in yourself instead of waiting for someone else to see your worth first. I walked down that aisle alone. I said my vows in front of 63 people who showed up for me. I built a business on the other side of the worst day of my life. I rebuilt a relationship with my family, not by pretending the damage didn't happen, but by insisting on honesty instead of comfort. And I'm standing here on the other side of all of it, older, clearer, more whole than I have ever been. And I can tell you with everything I have that it was worth it. Every hard day was worth it. Every night I doubted myself was worth it. Every moment I chose to keep building instead of giving up was worth it. Not because the story ended perfectly. It didn't. Life doesn't. But because I ended up knowing myself in a way I never would have if none of this had happened. Because I built something real with my own hands. Because I have a husband who sees me completely, a business I'm proud of, a handful of friendships that are bone deep, and a family that is slowly, imperfectly learning to show up for me the way I always needed them to. Because I am Olivia. I am 29 years old. I walked down that aisle alone. And what they saw next, what they saw in the years that followed, in the business I built and the person I became and the dignity I kept even when they gave me every reason not to, was someone who had decided quietly and permanently that she was never going to make herself small again. That's the story. That's all of it. Before you go, if any part of this resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the background character in a story that should have included you front and center, leave a comment below and tell me, what did you build on the other side of your hardest moment? I genuinely want to know. Subscribe if you're not already, because there are more stories coming and I promise you they are all real and they are all worth sticking around for. Hit that like button if this one meant something to you. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.